As well as pillaging and plundering, the Vikings knew how to party and would use any excuse to throw a rave. It might be to celebrate a wedding, or perhaps a successful battle or raid, or to honor a lost warrior at a burial. Maybe because it was the beginning of winter, or the end of winter, or even the middle of winter. I'll drink to that. Whatever the occasion, Vikings knew how to come together, eat, drink, socialize, and generally have a good time. But what was a Viking party really like? Welcome to the Viking Vault. The Hall. The Vikings built large buildings at the center of their communities. These mead halls or feasting halls were not simply a symbol of a ruler's wealth and status, they were also built with something else in mind, throwing a shindig. Noted guests and dignitaries would be received there and social gatherings would be held. In the early Middle Ages, the chieftain or king of the community would often use the hall as his residence, a place where he could oversee any social activities. Most of these halls, like the ones found and uncovered in Denmark, were around 50 meters long, which is about half the length of a football pitch. In Suffolk, England, a 5th or 6th century village has been excavated and was found to have 8 halls of varying sizes. There are a few Viking accounts of large mead halls built especially to host Scandinavian royalty at important feasts. The Icelandic historian and poet Snorri Sturluson wrote a collection of king sagas in the 13th century known as the Heimskringla. He recounted a tale of a 9th century Värmlandish chieftain named Aki who was very rich and very old. Aki invited both the Swedish king Erik Amundsen and the Norwegian king Harald Fairhair to a feast. Aki had a great feasting hall that was very old, and he also had a new hall ornamented in the most splendid way. When the kings arrived, Erik and his followers were taken to the old hall, and Harald and his entourage to the new one. The halls were similar, and King Erik and his courtiers were given vessels and horns that were gilded and splendid, but King Harald was presented with, quote, vessels and horns adorned with gold, or with carved figures shining like glass, with the best of liquor. When asked by King Erik why Aki had made such a difference between himself and King Harald, Aki said he gave Erik an old drinking utensil because he was old, and he gave Harald new things because he was in the bloom of youth. That didn't go down too well, and a humiliated King Erik killed Aki. In the Ynglinga part of the Heimskringla, Sturluson recounted a tale of how the 8th century King Ingjalds the Bad built a large hall and invited to his feast 6 kings, earls, and other men of consequence, just so he could set fire to it and burn them all alive after they fell into a drunken sleep. Apparently this ploy was popular and also used by the Norwegian ruler Sigurd Jarl and by the Swedish King Erik the Victorious to get rid of a minor Swedish king who was becoming a bit of a pest in the later 10th century. Halls played a huge part in the Norse mythology too. One of the most famous examples is Valhalla, the majestic hall where the god Odin receives half of those who have died in battle. The other half enter Sessrunir and are greeted by the goddess Freya. Festivals. The Vikings used the changing of the seasons as their calendar rather than the months of the year as we do today. The movements of the sun and the moon acted as their clock in a cycle of life and death. For them, there were 2 seasons rather than 4, summer and winter, with 4 main festivals throughout the year. For the Vikings, the beginning of winter was around the time when we would celebrate Halloween. It was the end of the harvest, a time to honor the dead and prepare for the dark winter to come. Yule or Yol in the middle of winter, when the year is at its darkest, was a time of sacrifice to bring back the sun and guarantee a good harvest to come. The end of winter and the beginning of summer for the Vikings was around the time of our Easter holidays, and midsummer at the solstice was a time for healing, love, and fertility, with its long, light nights. The Vikings called these feasts blot, which roughly translates as sacrifice or worship. Hallsblot was the autumn sacrifice made at the end of harvest time before the onset of the winter nights. The greatest feast of all was Yule, during the winter solstice on the shortest day of the year. For 12 whole days, the Vikings celebrated with feasting and dancing. Bonfires would be lit not just to keep warm, but because the fires had mystical importance and would repel the evil spirits during the long winter nights. The flames also symbolized the reappearance of the sun in the coming months and the hope and renewal of spring. The giving of gifts was also an important part of the festivities to represent the idea of charity and generosity. Handmade presents such as jewelry, clothing, or even weapons would be given to friends and family as a token of gratitude. This helped to instill loyalty and strengthen relationships. Other feasts revolved around the worship of certain deities like Disir, female guardian spirits similar to the Valkyries. Their honoured feast, known as Disablot, was however a much more somber occasion with communal meals and animal sacrifices. With the exception of parties held for specific occasions such as weddings and battle victories, each feast had its distinct name that expressed the Viking relationship with their gods, nature, and their community. Party games. Feasts and festivals were a time for competitions and games. Some of the more sedate ones were board games called Tafel, which we think were very similar to chess. Another popular game of skill and strategy that the Vikings loved was called Cub, and involved throwing wooden blocks at more wooden blocks to knock them over. Other competitions were a little more brutal, like sword fighting, wrestling, tug of war, or throwing bones at one another to see who could inflict the greatest amount of pain. Competitions were also held for skating and skiing to see who had the best endurance or the fastest technique. Drinking games were always popular as a way to show off a man's ability to imbibe massive quantities of alcohol while maintaining his wits and perception and staying upright. Seeing who could be held underwater for the longest period was another favoured challenge, but perhaps best not performed just after the drinking contest. Flighting competitions were also held in the feasting hall. Two people would exchange insults and the winner would be decided by the reactions of those watching. The verbal joust would often be conducted in verse. The modern equivalent might be the rap battles of hip-hop or throwing shade popularized by the drag scene. The winner of the flight would be the one who could no longer compose a decent response, either because of a lack of literary inspiration or because of the effects of copious amounts of alcohol that were drunk during the flight. Entertainment. From archaeological digs of Viking settlements, we know that they used a wide range of woodwind, brass, and stringed musical instruments, as well as drums. Many of them resemble those still used today, like the flute. The Vikings made these from the animal bones of cows, sheep, or deer. The lure was a trumpet-like instrument, usually made from wood. The teiglharpa was a harp with strings made from horsehair. Percussion instruments are thought to include a drum rather like the Irish bodhran, bells, and rattles. It's difficult to know what sort of compositions the Vikings played at their celebrations without any written down music, but we do know that it wasn't to everyone's taste. Ibrahim ibn Yabak was a 10th century traveller thought to have come from the Moorish-ruled kingdom of Catalonia in Spain. Jakob spent time at a Viking settlement on the German-Danish border and had first-hand experience of their singing, commenting that he, quote, "Never heard any more awful singing than the singing of the people in Scaleswig. It is a groan that comes out of their throats similar to the bark of dogs, but even more like a wild animal." Perhaps they sounded like some of the vocals from Scandi death metal bands today. For the more cultured, there were poetry readings and drinking songs from skalds who told epic stories of adventure that honoured kings and jarls. As the Yule festival said to be the greatest of Viking feasts, the songs were usually full of hope for the coming year, told tales of gods and heroes, and spoke of wisdom and courage. The oral songs and stories not only entertained, but were crucial in handing down Viking culture in a society that had no literary tradition. Food and drink. Eating and drinking were a central part of a Viking party, some of which went on for days. Meat was one of the staples of their diet, and they ate a wide variety, including pork, beef, chicken, horse, and lamb. Some feasts involved sacrificing animals to honor the gods. Livestock were slaughtered, and the blood would be collected and sprinkled on the statues of the gods around the walls of the hall, and even on the guests before the meat was roasted and then eaten. Vegetables would be served cooked in butter, and there was a whole range of dairy products. Bread, another staple, was usually made with wheat and barley. If fish was on the menu, it might be salmon, herring, or cod. The dishes were often flavoured with herbs and spices. In fact, the Vikings ate pretty well. At the Yule festival, a roasted pig would often be the centerpiece of the meal, its head decorated with apples or other fruits. Vikings were, of course, well known for their brewing skills, and alcohol played a major part in Viking life. Along with ale made from fermented barley, hops, and wheat, there was the strong and sweet wine-like mead made from honey and water, as well as other fruit wines. Both ales and wines might be flavoured with herbs such as elderflower, mint, or chamomile. Ale was drunk every day, but mead was special and known as the drink of the gods. The Vikings believed that the god Kvasir travelled far and wide teaching and spreading knowledge, but two dwarves killed him and drained him of his blood. They mixed the blood with honey and created the mead of poetry, which gave the drinker scholarship and wisdom, resulting in poetry being given to mankind. An important ritual during feasts was the sacred toasts, and they were always a great excuse for consuming more alcohol. Not that the Vikings needed an excuse. The first toast was to the gods, the second to the ancestors, and the third to the king or chieftain. Words of honor were said after each toast. Often the host would have his horn filled with mead and then pass it around so that the guests could each take a sip, or it was sometimes served in large bowls and passed around in the same way. Communal feasts were the perfect opportunity to gather together and mingle as a community, share stories, food, drink, and make alliances. Viking parties were a vital part of their social structure, and they really knew how to throw one. Thank you so much for watching this episode of the Viking Vault. Please do subscribe if you're enjoying these videos, and I'll see you next week for another one. Until then, have a fantastic week. Cheers!